A couple of years ago, a fairly unknown man named Shinori Katase stated in an interview that while not necessarily canon, he pictured the worlds of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X to be connected. This being as he had always thought Shinra, a well-known side character in the Final Fantasy X sequel, Final Fantasy X-2, would eventually found the corporation of the same name that appears in Final Fantasy VII, which fans of the series had theorized for years, along with a few other similarities between the two games. This got me thinking, just how many of the main series titles from the original to the latest as of writing this script, Final Fantasy XV, with 16 just around the corner, which among these is connected? I would like to point out, this script was originally started before Final Fantasy VII Remake came out, and seeing as we're now in a post-Rebirth world, it's been a minute. That being said, I will not be including the 7 remakes in this autopsy, theory, whatever you want to call it, as even after Rebirth, the evidence we have for worlds connecting seems a bit stronger, spoiler wording, but we still don't know enough about how 7 connects to other worlds in its multiverse. So until the final segment of that comes out, I won't be touching it, but once the final part does come out, we know how the story wraps up and how Square's trying to tie it all together, then perhaps we'll do a little bonus video to this one. But until then, before you ask, we will be including main series sequels such as the already mentioned X-2 and others such as Lightning Returns or Final Fantasy IV The After Years. However, with that being said, we will not be including spin-offs like the Crystal Chronicles series or even the worlds of Final Fantasy Tactics, even though we know it to be in the same world of Ivalice as Final Fantasy XII. We will also not be including Final Fantasies 11 or 14 in this video, outside of some lore chunks when we discuss a potential timeline at the end of the video. This is because of the numerous crossovers the two MMO have had with the entirety of the series throughout the years. Definitely spells out a connection, and that's the easy way out. When writing the script, I'd also found a few more mini-theories that I wouldn't mind talking about. I'll pull up minor details on these as we go along. If you'd like me to go more in depth on them, let me know in the comment section down below. And with that, let's get started. In the many worlds of Final Fantasy, there are a few constantly overlapping things among them. The first and most obvious, especially in the older titles, are the crystals. These elemental marvels were the main plot in Final Fantasy 1, 3, 4, and 5, surprisingly skipping over Final Fantasy 2. Another is the Void. While only called this in Final Fantasy V, I do have to point out that it does appear in far more games than one might think. A third thing is the ever-lovable character Gilgamesh, as it's been stated in canon that every one of his appearances is the same exact Gilgamesh, as he's appeared in Final Fantasies 1, for the After Years, 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, Revenant Wings, 13, 13-2, 14, and as recently as 15. Fourth are the Lunarians, who have been around since the beginning in Final Fantasy I. Although Square seems to have forgotten about them in newer Final Fantasies, we'll touch up on them later. And last, and probably the least relevant, is the Heavens, making its first official appearance in Final Fantasy VI in the fight against Godform Kefka. It has also appeared in 2 other titles, these being Final Fantasy VII against Sephiroth, and in Final Fantasy II against one of the incarnations of the Emperor. I'd also like to point out that Cid has appeared in every main series game since he showed up in Final Fantasy II. While I don't think it's that important overall, Team 4-Star made a joke about all the Cids being related in their Final Fantasy VII Machina Bridge series, and I thought it was worth pointing out, because if this theory turns out to be true, they very well could be. But with those few similarities out of the way, let us move on to where it all began. Final Fantasy I. As the first game in the series, I doubt that Squaresoft had much of a plan when they decided to cast their last hopes and dreams into one game to save their dying company. So, while the original release of this game doesn't really hold any merit to a theory like this, it's its ports and re-releases that we want to take a look at. The GBA port, specifically. During said ports, the developers added a few new things besides an updated system and better looks. There are only 2 things that hold our interest today, however. The 4 added elemental dungeons, and the change of the background in the final boss fight against Chaos Garland. While the dungeons only really serve as an Easter egg collection of bosses from other games, these being 3, 4, 5, and 6, the Temple of Water, Lifespring Grotto, hosts the 2 bosses from Final Fantasy V, Shinryu and Omega. It also has one other cameo if you talk to NPCs in a particular order. Gilgamesh makes a brief appearance in this dungeon and even blocks the player from progressing until you defeat him. This, in canon, is the same Gilgamesh as the Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V. Also, the main plot of the game, you are gathering 4 elemental crystals. We'll take note for that at the timeline at the end of the video. As for what I said about Chaos Garland, in the original game, you fight him against the background that was throughout the entirety of the final dungeon, but in later releases of the game, the background was changed to the party fighting him on the edge of the void. Another thing to briefly point out is the race of Lunarians, which again we'll come back to later. Final Fantasy II. Once again, I don't think Square had much of a plan for connecting all their games on the production of their early games. even the remakes of Final Fantasy II don't really hold any merit to them. However, the 20th anniversary of Dawn of Souls released a little side story called Soul of Rebirth that adds a small expansion to the world's lore. When the Emperor is killed in his human form, instead of just descending into pandemonium, his soul actually splits into two, with the other half rising to Aruboth, this world's version of the Heavenly Realm, where the Emperor tries to play God, but is stopped by the fallen adventurers of the main game. Final Fantasy II has more lore behind it from a timeline perspective, so we'll talk more about one of the fanbase's most hated games when we talk about building the timeline. Final Fantasy III, like a lot of the early games, doesn't have a lot of connections to tie together with other worlds. Even remakes and re-releases don't help this poor little gem. However, this is the second game in the franchise to feature an epic RPG in which you can collect 4 treasures of the elements. This game also hosts the grounds for the first mini-theory I had while writing the script. Cloud of Darkness is Enuo from Final Fantasy V. This mini-theory lets me tie 3 into the theory a little bit easier, as Cloud of Darkness doesn't really have any in-game mention until the very end, and she isn't even one of those, oh hey, you beat the final boss, now face the real final boss of the game characters either. She just is the final boss. Now Zoran, I hear you saying while pushing up your anime glasses and getting ready to correct me in the comments. Enuo was male, and Cloud of Darkness is female. And right you are, person always trying to be smart and everyone else in the comments section. When human, before being swallowed by the Void, Enuo was indeed male. But after being corrupted by the power of darkness and the Void, Enuo, while keeping a humanoid appearance, is no longer a person, just an entity of magic, and a strong one at that. Taking the form of something else would not be that impressive a feat, especially seeing as a much weaker character in the lore of the same game, Exdeath, can also do the same thing, meaning that the darkness leaking through to take over the world is from the Void. This is also the first game that includes the summons. Final Fantasy IV. So we come to the first and only game in the franchise to feature the Lunarians as a prominent race. We'll get more into them as we talk about a timeline. Notable things to point out about 4, however, is the fact that it has far many more crystals than any other game in the series, mainly hosting the 4 crystals of light and the 4 crystals of darkness in the underworld, with many more being aboard the Lunarian ships. Again, this will have more of a bearing on our timeline. Speaking of the Lunarian ships though, this is the first instance of space in any of these games. Moving forward, however, I'll be considering the Void and space as one and the same entity, making 3 its first technical appearance according to this theory in terms of release order. This is also one of the few games where summons are depicted as their own beings, doing their own things, and not being summoned forth to fight. Final Fantasy V. The game has so many linchpins to this theory. Final Fantasy V was the first appearance of the Void, the ever-lovable Gilgamesh. Through the events of the game, the main antagonist of the game, Exdeath, banishes his subordinate Gilgamesh to the Void. The party then meets up with him again later in the Void, where he apparently blows himself up to kill Necromancer. However, we know this not to be the end of Gilgamesh the Great, as it has been stated that every single one of his appearances in the main series games is canonically the same Gilgamesh, proven by his numerous references to Bartz and friends, while in the Void, and in his other appearances. As for the Void itself, it seems to be an endless sea of stars and worlds. It is also the domain from which Exdeath and the wizard Enuo draw their power. Enuo apparently gave up his immortality to conquer the Void, but is still alive 1,000 years later to fight the party in the Sealed Temple. This game is also the only other game to feature more than 4 elemental crystals, holding 4 in each half of the world before they are reconnected. Another interesting character to point out from the game would be Gogo the Mimic, who is the only character besides Gilgamesh to be in more than one game, and is theorized to be the same character. Unlike Gilgamesh, however, this is yet to be confirmed by Square Enix, so I won't take this into account when forming the timeline. Final Fantasy VI. While not my personal favorite, Final Fantasy VI is, in my opinion, the best overall game in the series. The biggest thing to take away from 6 when connecting it to other games is the Espers, or summons, from this version of the world, and their homeland. 2 characters also make an appearance in this game. Gilgamesh makes his first return as a secret boss of the Colosseum when the party bets the Excalibur. This is the first reference to Gilgamesh collecting famous swords as he passes from world to world. It is also one of 2 games where Gilgamesh appears as a summon for the party. The second is Gogo, which makes his second, and as far as I can tell, his last appearance in the series outside of boss fights in the online games. This time, however, instead of guarding the Mimic job, he's a playable character who functions as a Mimic. Another thing to note is the lack of magic in this entry. Another thing we will touch upon later. Something I wish to point out, but won't have too much relevance to later, is the home of the Espers. I'll be coming back to that. Lastly, the realm known as the Heavens makes its first appearance in this title. At the very end of the game, you find yourself face to face with Godform Kefka, who has transcended the mortal realm, and his boss arena is consistent with other versions of the Heavens we see throughout the series. Final Fantasy VII. Oh boy. Now Zoran, you have to be very careful when talking about this game. One bad thing and the whole internet will hate you for it. Best of luck. Here we go. One of the 2 games in the series that's higher than 6 in most people's eyes. Final Fantasy VII. The PlayStation 1 title that took the West by storm. It doesn't even break my top 5. It does, however, have many connections and a lot to bring up, I noticed as I was writing the script. Final Fantasy VII may just be the connecting point for all the games. And I wrote that line 3 years before Rebirth came out. Rebirth only reiterated that strength. So yeah. First off, space. Constantly looming over the sky, threatening to destroy the world, is a meteor, a giant rock from space. However, I want to bring up the particular version of space. It's ours. As seen in Safer Sephiroth's ultimate attack, the world of Final Fantasy is ours. I want you to keep this in mind for later, as it's not too relevant for now. I'd also like to note that this is the game when it seems that the people of the world are first starting to learn how to travel through space on their own, with no ancient technology or magic to help them, as seen when Shinra tries to launch Cid's rocket at Meteor. This will also come up later as we try to establish a timeline. Now secondly is the Heavens, the place where you fight Safer Sephiroth, looking almost completely identical to the one in which Kefka was fought in Final Fantasy VI, and only one of 3 times in the entire series a place like this is shown. This is important for later. This is not all for Final Fantasy VII, but we'll come back to it when we discuss the timeline. Final Fantasy VIII, a game that people love to hate. It's one of my personal favorites, but I can see why people don't like it. Another game featuring the void of space. This one, however, is a bit more short-lived with a few short scenes towards the end of the game, which has my favorite Squall and Renoa moment. But I do think that this shows a further explanation of the void than 7. This also brings a character named Laguna into the fold, which will bring up another theory of mine when we get to the timeline. Gilgamesh once again makes a return in this game as well. I wonder how many people who have casually played 8 ever encountered Gilgamesh, as he can only be obtained after Odin, but before the events of Lunatic Pandora. Final Fantasy IX. I don't actually have a lot to say about Final Fantasy IX. It does have familiar summons such as Bahamut, but that's its only real connection with the rest of the series. Sure, it has a lot of references to the other games as it was a love letter to end off an era, but even Gilgamesh in 9 is so different from the rest of his appearances in the series that it's hard to see it as the same Gilgamesh. However, his appearances are canonically the same character. If you have any idea how that could be, or if you think of something that I missed, let me know in the comments. Because this character in 9 is the only one that really hurts the statement that he's the same character. Final Fantasy X and X-2. The controversy that started this whole video. This supposed prequel to 7 in the eyes of the creators doesn't actually have a lot for us to go off of. There is no realm of the heavens, and the only thing we see like the void is the room where we fight Unalesca towards the end of the game. The real evidence doesn't come until its own sequel in Final Fantasy X-2. Where this whole controversy began with a character named Shinra. At one point in the game, he says he's going to found his own company, thus the start of Shinra Inc., that appears in Final Fantasy VII. This is all we really have for these 2 titles, unless you want to believe the Far Plane is some part of the void. Final Fantasy X-2, we get to explore the more vast reaches of the Far Plane on our way down to fight Shuyin and Vegnagun, the first part of which seems a peaceful place where the souls of the dead remain after death, for the most part. Again, to be brought up later. Then, moving deeper into the Far Planes where we finally get more evidence of a void-like area, as YRP makes its way down to the bottom of the Far Plane. Wait, bottom? There shouldn't be a bottom to the void. Disprove theory. Okay, wrap up the video. Actually, this isn't the only game in the series like this, so hold up pushing your anime glasses for later. There's also a bottom to the void in Lightning Returns, but we'll get to that. But this only applies to the bottom, as I believe the upper reaches of the Far Plane hold a different purpose. And another mini-theory that I would love to dive more into. The Far Plane is the home of the Espers from Final Fantasy VI. We'll touch up more on this one during the timeline, but if you want me to dive deeper into the subject, let me know. Final Fantasy XII. Another game in the series with not a whole lot of evidence connecting it to the other main series games. Ivalice is connected to a lot of side games, as I mentioned at the start of the video, like the Tactics series. The only thing I could find, at all, is Gyrovagan, being void-like in some parts of it. And of course, the appearance of Gilgamesh finally carries enough evidence on him that we need to show that the worlds are somewhat connected, as he holds replicas of the Buster Sword from Final Fantasy VII, the Revolver Gunblade from Final Fantasy VIII, the Orichalcum from what I assume is Final Fantasy V, because that's the only version of the Orichalcum that's not a dagger, Excalibur from Final Fantasy VI, assuming this is the one that we bent in the fight against him, and Brotherhood from Final Fantasy X. However, Ivalice, I believe, is a bit more unique than the rest of the Final Fantasy worlds. I'll discuss more as to why at the end of the video. Final Fantasy XIII, XIII-2, and Lightning Returns. This is the one trio of games that have a very interesting history since its release. Fairly received upon its release, only to be hated for years, and now seems to be slowly crawling its way back out of obscurity. Unlike 7, one of these 3 does make my top 5. Have fun with that comment section. I may be the only person who thinks there isn't a single bad Final Fantasy game. Wait, what do you mean we have to talk about 15 as well? What's up next? Okay, maybe one bad game. In terms of setting up a timeline, these games are probably the most important of the whole series. As to connect them to the rest of the series, it'll require a bit of jumping into the data logs, which is a rabbit hole I would love to jump into with all of you someday, but for shortness' sake, Gilgamesh makes an appearance in 13.2 as a Colosseum boss. We also can't forget the summons Odin, Bahamut, and Alexander, which make appearances in other games as well. I'll be discussing more of this in the timeline part of the video, however I will say that 13 is the origin point for many things. Final Fantasy 15. Okay, I'll be the first to admit I'm not the biggest fan of 15. It suffers from what a lot of AAA titles from Squaresoft suffer. They're grand, they're flashy, and the world looks really good, but for the cost of story. Kingdom Hearts 3 suffers the same fate, and for a series known for really good stories, it's not the greatest thing to forego for spectacle. This has caused it to be one of the only games I have not 100% cleared. Gilgamesh makes an appearance in this game, but only as part of the paid DLC, because Square can't release a completed start-to-finish story anymore. I have way too high hopes that they might fix this with 16, but I doubt it. Hey, guess what? They kind of did, but then ruined it with the Leviathan DLC. So close yet so far. Another thing it shares with other games is summons. Although the only real summon is Rama, as the rest are all story-specific summon locations. Another thing to point out, that in this world, the summons are viewed as gods. There's also, of course, a couple giant crystals in the game, but we'll get back to that. As we've previously established, the Final Fantasies that hold this heavenly realm are 2, 6, and 7. All of which are seen during the final boss fights against the Emperor, Kefka, and Sephiroth respectively. Going back and looking through all the games again, I noticed that 15 may also apply for the Heavenly Realm when Noctis is talking to Bahamut, although personally I think that's more Void-like than Heaven-like, but it's up to you how you wish to interpret it. However, 15 throws a big wrench in how I decided to line up a timeline. We'll get into that in a little bit. Void/space. As I stated earlier, for the sake of this theory, I consider space and the void to be the same thing, and the connecting point for all the games. But Zoran, I hear you say, not all the games include the void and or space. Right you are. The games where it appears are 1, 3, 4, for the after years, 5, 7, 8, 10, 2, 12, Lightning Returns, and 15. With 12 being loosely connected, as I stated before, and I'm not entirely sure that it actually does. But that is a good chunk of the series. Even more if you consider 3 of them are sequels, which would count the other games in those lines. However, the Void itself is more important than the games that it appears in, as traversing the Void is part of what connects these glorious worlds. Another thing to keep in mind is that just because it's not shown in other games doesn't mean it's not there. It only shows up when it's relevant to the plot or part of a boss battle in other games. However, as you'll find out, the games it doesn't appear in don't really matter when we line up the timeline. Summons. A lot of the Final Fantasy games have summons, most notably 15, 13, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and 3. And while yes, 12 does indeed have its own summons, once again, those are versions of the summons that are only found in the world of Ivalice. The main version of these summons being Shivra, Ifrit, Rama or Ramu, depending on what version of the game you play, Odin, Leviathan, and Bahamut, crossing almost all these games with each other. Most of them have many forms that they take throughout the years. Another idea that came to me while making this script is a story of the summons that follows the summons from a beginning to end and how they would work in this timeline. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. Lunarians. Okay, now for the big one. The Lunarians have been in the series since Final Fantasy I. In that game, they are the ones responsible for building Tiamat's flying fortress. While this was only intended to represent the wind theme of the dungeon, the Lunarians have other appearances as well, the most notable being in Final Fantasy IV, with the main character being a Lunarian himself. The Lunarians are spacefaring people with more than one ship to roam the stars, as shown in Final Fantasy IV The After Years. While not canon, I believe that for this theory, the name was originally derived from Laguna, once humans began to show a stronger interest in traveling space, like in Final Fantasy VII and VIII. I should also point out the Cetra here, but I believe that they're their own entities, and I'm about to explain why, as we finally move on to the timeline, which might surprise you how it begins. The timeline. Final Fantasy XIII. I believe that Final Fantasy XIII is the first in the series. While it's not touched on until Lightning Returns, this is an era of gods and their creations. While other things later in the series are depicted as gods, Final Fantasy XIII is the only one that's depicted as an origin story for the universe they live in. Also, I have to bring up Gwyn here, as she's technically Buenavel's mother, but has no actual mention in the main series outside of an amulet you can find in the DLC of 13.2, so she doesn't really count. She plays a much larger role in the online lore though. I'd recommend looking into it if you have the time. It's during this time that one of Velza creates the first three gods, Pulse, Lindsay, and Etro. Pulse created the world of Grand Pulse and the Fal'Cie that aid in terraforming the land to find the Door of Souls, which links the living world with the afterlife. Lindsay produced a Fal'Cie deserving Velza's desire to defy death as he entered deep sleep until the door would be found. Etro, being discarded for resemblance to Velza's mother, sacrificed herself, disappearing from the world, and humankind was born out of her blood through Lindsay's power. Etro became a keeper of the Door of Souls, serving to preserve its natural order, which Velza was attempting to disrupt with his Fal'Cie. According to legend, Lindsay creates Cocoon and tasks the Fal'Cie with maintaining it, and luring humans to live in the paradise. However, both Lindsay and Pulse were gone without a trace, leaving their representative Fal'Cie orphaned. Lindsay's Fal'Cie devised a plan to mass sacrifice the humans of Cocoon to force Etro's gate to reveal itself and summon back their maker. This plan needed to involve Pulse's Fal'Cie and their chosen human servants, as Lindsay's Fal'Cie could not destroy themselves, nor use their own servants against themselves. Lindsay's Fal'Cie seek to destroy their own power source, Orphan, and deactivate Cocoon, with the resulting crash killing all its residents, thus the events of Final Fantasy XIII. I bring up this much lore right here off the bat because from all the games, it's the only real lore dump we get. These stories also tie into the lore of 11 and 14 if you wanted to include them. Well, this doesn't even really matter until Lightning returns, where mankind suddenly seems to remember that the gods other than the Fal'Cie overlords actually exist, because they totally existed when Square made the first game, right? Also, the events of 13.2 leave everyone unable to age, turning them into semi-immortal, as they can still die from being killed or by any means other than aging. At the end of the game, Lightning, powered by Etro, defeats Velza and casts him down to the bottom of the void. Same thing he did to his mother, if you're curious. Seriously, you should go look up some of that lore. There's also this whole plot about an ark and the souls of the world getting trapped in it. That's important, I guess, as Lightning leads the souls to a new world. Now, earlier in the video, I said to take note of the world which Safer Sephiroth casts his ultimate attack at. Well, not actually our Earth per se. It does seem to have a similar path and similar looking planets. It is also the path that the souls take to reach their new world. This, for the sake of this theory, is the origin point of the Cetra. The last remaining god of the now ruined world is Lightning, now potentially the last immortal wandering the world, avoiding future problems of humanity. I say potentially here, as there is one other character I believe may still be immortal because of these events, and the humans being the last to be directly touched by one of Velza before their rebirth, now able to hear the sounds and voice of the earth. The summons of the 13 party hide themselves away in a separate realm to avoid being used by the humans to help conquer their newly peaceful world. Final Fantasy VI. An era of peace and prosperity has led to the rise of an empire. The legends of magic and gods now long forgotten, save for a hidden realm of summons. Without the gods to grant them magic anymore, the humans get greedy and start looking to new ways to find power, with machines, and eventually stealing magic from the summons themselves, eventually leading to Kefka's destruction of the world and its populace once more, rendering themselves once again unable to use magic with his defeat. And most of the summons are now turned to crystal to be used by humanity, hidden away by the heroes of Final Fantasy VI, but they will find themselves back to the surface later. Final Fantasy II. Having to rebuild towns and keeps to defend themselves after Kefka ruined the world, a few hundred years go by as people start giving themselves power instead of drawing it from other sources. Finally, an explanation for the lousy level up mechanic in this game. Yay! The Empire is in control once again, leading to a confrontation where our heroes must once again enter the realm of the heavens. People are once again in an age of peace, where they can use their time to rebuild. Final Fantasy X. Finally, the peaceful era leads to prosperous cities such as Bevelle and Zanderkand. The discovery of the realm of the Fog Plane before the Great War begins, leading to the events of Sin and the rest of the game. Personally, I think the Fog Plane, or at least its upper levels, is where the summons from 6 live before the crisis. Now all that remains of them are their memories and faith in themselves to exist. Oh wait, I get it. Tendu doesn't have much of an impact on the timeline other than introducing Shinra as a character and having him establish his own company. Final Fantasy VII. The lives of the Cetra long vanish and are now little more than legends, as most have died out due to the calamities of the ancient past. The story plays out here as it normally does and continues on a few more centuries before the events of Final Fantasy VIII. Do keep in mind now though that there's a loophole that potentially lies here, as both Vincent and Lightning are now 2 immortal beings roaming the planet over the years. You're welcome, fanfic writers. However, there was another option for how Lightning ended up, but that's a theory for another time. Final Fantasy VIII. Here I believe people finally start exploring space enough to start venturing off into other worlds. Founded under the leadership of Laguna, the Lunarians are born. This is the final event of this storyline of worlds, as I believe the rest of the games are taking place another, well, two in particular, actually. The World of the Crystals and Fractured Souls. When Lightning leaves Grand Pulse behind, she also leaves behind the Nova Crystallia. And I did say that we wouldn't be pulling facts from 11 and 13, but one thing I've noticed is that the Nova Crystallia can break off fragments. I believe that when Grand Pulse was destroyed, at least a little bit of the crystal fragmented and landed on other worlds. During the travel, though, I believe that some of the souls led by Lightning may have branched off, following instead these crystal fragments as their guiding light. These crystals also hold in some fashion the memories and souls of the summons that departed with Lightning. Final Fantasy V, Enuo Era. Taking place just a few years after the events of 13, Enuo finds a way to use magic, possibly granted by the crystals, to re-enter the void. With no gods or Felsi to stop him, and an urge to replace the gods that once controlled them, Enuo tries taking over the void, only to be overpowered by the sheer power of this vast realm, and trapped within it. It is also implied that to gain the power of the void that he did, Enuo had to give up immortality. This begs the question, did more people keep their immortality when leaving Pulse, or was it just Enuo and Lightning? Who knows? It'll be hundreds of years before we see him again. Final Fantasy IV. Now being several hundred years post-Pulse destruction, the Lunarians have become their own race of people and have found a new world. It is established in the events of the after years that this isn't the first visit of the Lunarians. In a previous visit, they could have found various crystals of the world and used them to power their ships, taking most of the crystals with them when they leave, leaving only 8 remaining in the world, 4 of light and 4 of darkness, before eventually returning during the events of 4 and 4 the after years. Final Fantasy V, World Rending. Enuo returns to the world now significantly weakened with the lack of all its crystals. Being trapped long enough to now start controlling the void, the people use what power they have left with the crystals to stop him, sealing him within a temple in the void, and in doing so, rip the world in half, splitting its crystals even further, with 4 in each half of the world. Crystals of light in one, and those of darkness in the other. That would explain why Galus' world in the game looks so dead when compared to the other, and why the population of the dwarves seems so low in 5, with only a few being left in the world after it was torn. Who knows what happens to the underground when the world splits? Final Fantasy I. Finally, the game that launched it all, almost at the end of the timeline. Why does that sound familiar? Anyway, I believe that Final Fantasy I and our next entry take place during this time, as this is when the world holds 4 elemental crystals of light, thus the Light Warrior's name. The Lunarian descendants of Cecil and Rosa still wander the earth, building a fortress in the sky. During the final battle, as Garland draws on the power given to him by the 4 elemental fiends, the joining of the elements causes the void to react, ripping open behind him as they battle, not going unnoticed by its inhabitants. Final Fantasy III. As stated earlier in the video, I like the idea that Cloud of Darkness, in some part, is Enuo, or at least a manifestation of his magic, explaining why Cloud has no real name, just a title. The crystals, sensing his return, entrust more of their power to the new Heroes of Light, giving them the ability to master most forms of combat or magic, hence the job system. Due to the void opened by Garland in ages past, the barrier holding Enuo at bay weakens. Not being able to fully return due to the world being split, he can manipulate people to try destroying the crystals to remerge the worlds. That also sounds familiar. Anyway, once again, being stopped by the Heroes of Light, and no freer from his cage than where he started, as he continues to wait for his chance. Final Fantasy V. With all the mentions and nods to it throughout the other games, we finally hit the main events of Final Fantasy V. The crystal's destruction, the void spilling into the world from the rifts created by Exdeath, the merging of the worlds, reopening the main entrances to the void, to the party rediscovering the temple Enuo was sealed away in, and defeating him once and for all. Ending the story of the World of the Crystals, which fits together much better than I thought it would, but for all its fitting pieces, it has just as many plot holes. So let me know what you think those are in the comment section below. This wraps this up. Final Fantasy XII doesn't really have a place in this set of events. Perhaps Ivalice and its connected games of the Ivalice Alliance is a third world after the destruction of Pulse, the Okiria being more beings that retain their immortality like Lightning and Enuo. Final Fantasy IX was also very hard to place, so I didn't. For it to work, it has to be in a spot in both worlds. Summon Stones making it take place after 6 in Lightning's world, or taking place between 3 and 5 in the World of the Crystals for young Gilgamesh, before he grows up. As well as I couldn't find a good spot for 15, maybe at the end of the Crystal World timeline as it does involve some crystals, before FF4 in the New World timeline as the summons were still seen as gods. It has a few places it can go. There are loopholes like the Void also letting Gilgamesh travel through time as well as to new worlds, seeing his origins at the end of one timeline. That's not like that's never happened in Final Fantasy. And some pieces just don't quite fit without some more detail, but hence why it's a theory. Just something fun to do. I'd love to see what you guys think about all this in the comments section, if you have any interest in any of the mini theories I spouted throughout the video. And hey, I know this is a long video, so I appreciate to those of you who stuck around till the end. Thank you. I would love to give a huge shout out to Death Unites Us for writing the original version of the script, 4 years ago now, and giving me the encouragement I needed to actually do this. I'd like to also give a huge shout out to Dark Kefka, who is a big Final Fantasy fan. He gave me permission to use footage from his channel so long ago for a top 10 I wanted to make of his content. That I may or may not abuse the permissions for this. It depends on how much footage my editor ends up needing, because I'm recording all this before I send it off to him to be edited. So if we end up using it, a huge shout out to Dark Kefka for that. Or if we don't end up using it, still a huge shout out to him to being one of my YouTube heroes and keeping me in Final Fantasy when I was falling out of love with the series. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a like. If you really enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe. And I look forward to making more videos for you in the future. Take care.